We just heard some loud explosions.
The Federal Building had been at the center of the blast.
All of a sudden it got I felt a jolt, my head hit, and I felt this jolt on my cheek, and everything got very quiet. I started falling forward, and I kept fighting and trying to sit up, and I didn't know what was happening.
In the force of the explosion, the 5th floor, where Priscilla worked, collapsed. Unconscious, she fell straight through to the 2nd floor.
We got several injuries.
Can we get somebody over here? Keep all that stuff in one.
Man, this is bad. We've got a lot of people here. We need to get this house carried off.
Let's get that area from below. Let's concentrate on the area that's roped off. We'll search it from down below.
Then I heard someone say, "We have a live one here." And I'm listening because it sounded like they were way off in the distance. But the man actually took my hand.
Police officer Don Hull was among the first to arrive on the scene.
Smelled death. That's what you smelled. Everything being pulverized and burned, and it was just death. I remember carrying out one little boy, and he didn't have a face. It was gone. I laid him down, and I told him I was sorry.
"168 people were killed, 19 of them children under 5. There was a daycare center on the building's 2nd floor. Many Americans believed instinctively that the Oklahoma City bombing was the work of foreign terrorists. They were wrong.
Let us let our own children know that we will stand against the forces of fear. When there is talk of hatred, let us stand up and talk against it. When there is talk of violence, let us stand up.
2 years before the tragedy in Oklahoma City, federal agents had attacked the armed compound of a religious cult known as the Branch Davidians. More than 80 people were killed in an assault which ended a 51-day standoff played out on national television. The government action deepened the hatred of federal authorities held by Timothy McVeigh, a Gulf War veteran, and Terry Nichols, the 2 Americans who were later convicted of the Oklahoma City bombing. Radical extremists aside, many Americans do feel that their government has become something of an omnipresent and intrusive big brother. At the beginning of the century, Washington, D.C. represented little more than an abstract authority. Back then, government levied no taxes, issued few regulations, and offered no safety nets. It was survival of the fittest. But it became hard for even the fittest to survive when the stock market crashed in 1929 and signaled the country's economic collapse.
Our family felt the depression immediately. My father couldn't get a job. There was no unemployment insurance. There was no Social Security. There was no welfare. It was the end of everything.
Many people were waiting in soup lines for a bowl of soup and a piece of bread, and whole families, mother, father, and children, with nothing to eat and no place to spend the night. It was pitiful.
So many people felt that we were in danger of a revolution because there were many people who felt the government should do something and the government was doing nothing.
Strikes and protests were spreading. A revolution was averted when Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president in 1932.
Of course we spent money. It went to put needy men and women without jobs to work.
My father could get a job, so it was only $65 a month. All those young men sitting around, they got work. I know it is said that it really didn't cure the Depression, but it sure cured the Depression in our house. You know, it revolutionized the perception of what government owes the people and what its role is.
That government should be responsible for its citizens' welfare was a revolutionary idea, but it helped to shape modern America, and it reached its apogee in President Johnson's Great Society.
This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
My mother, she sit me down at the table and she laid out all of the bills in the house. And she laid out the water bill and the gas bill and what we planned to buy groceries. And she said, this is all the money that we have. One day, a community organizer came to our door to share information about the programs. They wanted to give you some exposure to culture. We obtained our first airplane ride, or to see a play, or the opera. The Great Society and the programs of the Great Society made you feel special. They wanted to encourage you, to let you know that you're important and that you can make it.
There seemed to be a government program for every social need. Many people benefited, but the government grew enormous, and so did the tax burden on the middle class. Those who had had enough saw a champion in Ronald Reagan. He vowed to reverse the trend started by President Roosevelt.
I believe it is clear our federal government is overgrown and overweight. Indeed, it is time our government should go on a diet.
Without giving up their benefits, Americans wanted to reduce the size and influence of federal agencies. Similar to the beginning of the century, a time when people had fewer taxes and government was less obvious.
The pendulum swings back and forth. There's a time when people look to the government to do a lot, and then there are times that they want the government to get out of their lives.
What people expect from their government stayed in flux throughout the century. It is one of those constantly evolving principles which influenced President Roosevelt when he called American democracy a story without an end. In 1903, the social philosopher W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Every decade since has proven him right." Stone Mountain, Georgia, has its own version of Mount Rushmore, a monument honoring the leaders of the Confederate side in the Civil War.
My aunt, she was instrumental in that carving being on the mountain. They got up money to start it. It is magnificent, and when I stand there and look at it, I nearly have tears in my eyes because they were wonderful men, and it was something they thought they were doing that was right.
They believed in white supremacy. That was their philosophy. It was just a way of life in the South.
In 1915, when the Ku Klux Klan announced its rebirth, it did so in Stone Mountain, Georgia.
My uncle worked for the Grand Wizard of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And as a child, I had the privilege of being carried to his home, and he treated me very nicely.
For every year until 1990, the Ku Klux Klan held a rally in Stone Mountain on the Saturday before Labor Day.
And they would go up and down our streets, and they would just be blowing their horn, and dust would be just everywhere, and we'd be saying, "Oh, there come the Ku Klux, here come the Ku Klux." It was fascinating and amazing to us as children. They was covered all in white, and the only thing that we saw as children was these little round things where they saw out of their eyes. And they used to burn a cross on the mountain. It was just remarkable, and they had the loudspeakers turned up loud enough, and we could sit on the porch and hear everything that they said. It was anything nigger. It was everything nigger. That was their thing.
Part of integration, so out of which will come a conglomerated, bloody, Mongol class of people. Both races will be destroyed in such a movement.
The methods are brutal, they're terroristic, and they are thugs.
Chuck Burris grew up in Louisiana.
Stone Mountain, to people of African descent who didn't live here but had heard about it, was a place of terror and fear. Not only to people of African descent, but to Jewish people, to Catholics. It basically stood for white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, male-dominated society.
Every minority group in this country's had to fight for itself, but none so long as African Americans. As they struggled for basic constitutional rights, they were faced with the terror and the dizzying contradictions of segregation.
We'll be demonstrating here until freedom comes.
In the 1950s, black Americans began to push more fervently for their civil rights. The response resembled a new kind of civil war.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation...
And we even had the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, spewing forth the politics of separation and dissolution of our unity as a nation. So I saw elderly men and women and children fire-hosed and beaten and having dogs attack them, sicked on them by the police because they wanted to register to vote. They wanted to drink out of a water fountain in a public park. They wanted to be able to sit at a lunch counter like everyone else. Simple things in life.
Black kids being beaten up in the South, there was nothing new about that. What was new about it was that it was filmed and people saw it. When you see the blood running out of someone's head for no other reason than they are asking the United States government to obey its own laws, then it becomes a national or an international event. There was a very simple reason for why so many things happened so quickly in the early 1960s, and that reason was television.
Let freedom ring.
In 1963, civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led a march on Washington. He spoke to a crowd of more than 200,000 people.
So let freedom ring.
It was so many black people there, but then it was so many white people that was going to be part of us accomplishing this freedom.
Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. I was just overwhelmed. Tears just started flowing down because that let me know that I was going to be a part of that freedom that was going to take place. That Moses had arrived for the black people, and we were going to be led. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
But more than 30 years later, not much has changed for many African Americans. On October the 16th, 1995, 400,000 African American men came from every state in the Union to the nation's capital. Dion Warner, a lawyer, made the journey from Houston, Texas. The gathering was organized by the Nation of Islam leader, Louis Farrakhan.
The real evil in America is called white supremacy. Because the idea of white supremacy means you should rule because you're white. That makes you sick.
I'm certain that there were many people who felt as though there would be some negative repercussions from having all those black males in one place at one time. And I think some of that is because what they see on the news every day, when they see people getting arrested or people doing drugs, are black men.
Black man, you don't have to bash white people. All we got to do is go back home and turn our communities into production.